So if you're having questions or concerns brought to you, even if it's specific to language, we have advocates in the room who have spent a lot of time, Jared being one of them, who we'll highlight in a bit. But please don't feel the need to do all of the research and responding to every single constituent concern. That is going to take up way too much of your time, and it's going to make you dislike this bill because of the sheer amount of work that you feel that you'll have to put into it. We have templates for responses. We've got the information for you. We want to make it simple. That's one of the benefits of being in the Climate Solutions Caucus. So if you're getting those and you're not sure as a new member how to navigate it, please talk to someone like myself or Gabrielle or the advocates. But we're holding strong, folks. We're moving through the process.
Thank you, Senator. And then the other thing that I don't know about you all, but I just received 2 emails, one regarding a bill proposed for an updated renewable energy standard yesterday, and then another email from one of our municipal utilities highlighting concerns with that. And I just want to touch upon the fact that, yes, we're aware that we're starting to see these. Unfortunately, we do not have time to touch on these right now, but we are going to figure out a way, maybe hopefully, to actually have a conversation as a Climate Solutions Caucus about this. Senator White said, reach out to advocates. Obviously, advocates have their own agendas and perspectives and what they're hoping to achieve. So depending on the bill at hand, you're going to see different perspectives and different alliances. So just flagging that. And there are a couple of handouts. I think we'll come back. If it's a handout, feel free to pass it out on your own. But I think otherwise we should transfer. All of that is to say, we're aware that you're getting emails. If you have specific questions, you can reach out to Senator White or me or Mike Rice, and we can also help out with other information as well. And we will try to find a time, which is not Thursday at lunch while you're chewing, to actually talk about some of the inherent rubs that at the very core, we know we need to be thoughtful and smart about how we use our resources because all of life depends on them. On the other hand, people still need to pay their bills and, private property, all of those pieces. So inherent rubs in much of the work that this caucus covers. With that, Representative Burke, Transportation Affordability Act.
Thank you for inviting me to present. So this Transportation Affordability Act, H101, is a proposal. I want to talk about it's not necessarily a freestanding bill. What happens every year, for people who don't know, is the Transportation Committee every year does a transportation bill, which includes everything, all the money that goes into roads, bridges, public transit, bike ped, motor vehicles, et cetera. Big, last year was $800 million. And so what the agency, and meaning the administration, will come and present their version of the bill that includes everything that's in this book, all these projects, and certain policy proposals. And in the past few years, some of us on the Transportation Committee have come up with sort of our own transportation proposals instead of just sort of receiving what the administration says and tinkering around the edges, thinking boldly about what we would like. And basically related to cutting carbon emissions, which has been my mission for the past 15 years, and also making affordable transportation, because we all know that fossil fuels are volatile price, and we want to make sure that people can get around necessary transportation needs more cheaply. So basically, I'm just going to go sort of through the statement of purpose of the bill, and I'll explain a couple of the things. And if you want to talk more, I can give you more details. Remember that this is all just a proposal that's going to be discussed within the context of the House Transportation Committee. And I can give you an example of something that happened today that sort of explains that process. So basically, there are 12 statements of purpose, requires the Agency of Transportation to make a written plan regarding efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase access to high efficiency, lower cost transportation options. Now we'll find out from the agency, are they doing that or not? These are the things. Maybe they are doing it, or maybe they might be doing it better. These are the questions that we'll be asking. The second one is to create a legislative regional transportation climate initiative working group. We know that the Transportation Climate Initiative TCIP sort of fell apart at the end of last year. Was it last year? I can't even remember now. And that we have been, some of us have been involved in reviving regional conversations about that. And this would sort of set up a little bit more formal structure to work with the National Council of Environmental Legislators on working with other states to see where their policies might be and to see if we might revive some kind of a regional cap and trade program, which would be very beneficial to Vermont. The next one is a self-funded fee-based program. Now this is, or there's another word for it, vehicle sort of something price adjuster. I can't remember.
Vehicle efficiency.
Vehicle efficiency price adjuster, which means that a low efficiency vehicle, a vehicle that didn't have to get very many miles would pay a higher registration fee, and people who have a more efficient vehicle would pay less. It would be revenue neutral. It's fairly controversial. But this really basically would just set up a task force to study the issue, and it only would go into effect if the task force didn't come up with any recommendations. So that's, just again, taking a little baby step. And then another sort of asking AOT is to assess the motor vehicle fuel use in Vermont to identify the most effective action to transition to EVs. Like, who's buying EVs? Do they need incentives? Who needs incentives? How can we make people, who are low income, give them more incentives to the low income people? So that's a study that could get, these are all things that just could get changed, eliminated, embellished. We don't know. Appropriate money for the MTI program. MTI is a Mobility and Transportation Innovation Grants. It's a fabulous program out of the public transit part of the agency. And last year we appropriated like 1.5 million, something like that. And this is one of the programs that has funded the microtransit project in Montpelier, the sort of Uber-like public transit project that's a pilot project that could be a model for other communities. It funds a lot of other bike ped related and emissions reduction things. And the proposal in my bill is to allocate $10 million. And last year we did 1.5. So, we'll see where these are just, again, may as well just put things out there. And the other one is to require AOT to provide a written recommendation on dedicated funding source for the non-federal match for public transit providers. This was lobbyists for the, Vermont Public Transit Association asked about this as a placeholder because they would like to discuss, for some local communities, like I think in Chittenden County, they're not really able to pay the local match. And how do what would be another way to, without burdening property tax owners, would be another way to provide the local match for public transit? So this is sort of just a placeholder. There's no clear thought about how to do this or what a funding source would be, but just to start thinking about this issue. Modifications to the incentive program for new PEVs and replace your ride and annual reporting requirements. We have incentives for new electric vehicles, for used electric vehicles through Capstone Community Action for low-income people, and a program called Replace Your Ride that hasn't really been, is just in the process of being implemented. And it's sort of modifying what the incentives would be, just small little tweaks to the program. It's been very successful. Amend the state's transportation planning policy related to greenhouse gas emissions and infrastructure resilience. Again, not very clearly stated, but just thoughts about, and we're thinking about how do we group all these things in one sort of reporting to get the information that we need. How are we doing on emissions? Are the policies that we're implementing actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And I think that's a sort of objective of the agency. There's Michelle Boomhauer over there from the agency. So we're all sort of on the same page about wanting that information, and are the policies that we're doing, are they really doing the job, or do they just sound good? They sound good. Anyway, and then update the complete streets policy and require training for municipalities. I worked on the complete streets bill in, I think it was 2011, which meant that any new transportation project need to consider the needs of all the users of the transportation system, not just motorists, but, persons with disabilities, bicyclists, pedestrians, et cetera. And this is coming from AARP, which has been the real lead on this complete streets policy, because recognizing that older people need various ways to get around, maybe not able to drive anymore or not wanting to drive anymore. So we've been working with AARP on this, and we'll sort of have more information about that as we go. Require AOT to update the Vermont state standards. I think that they're doing that. And that's really important because, as I've been hearing from my colleague, Kate Lally, is she here, who's a landscape designer and planner, that sometimes the standards get in the way of good ideas, the standards as they exist, especially for small communities, and how, in terms of the engineers looking at the standards and saying, no, we can't do this, whereas the towns want things to do. These are not, just ways to think about it. Then from our former colleague, Kurt McCormick, who's a very big Amtrak fan, retire AOT to work with Amtrak on modifications to service. Well, we have no ability to tell the railroad what to do, but we can, make suggestions. And some of this has to do with getting an extra train to either go through the state, an extra Vermonter train that would go up the East Coast and up to St. Albans and eventually getting to Montreal, or getting a train that would just go to White River, an extra train, because the trains go now to Massachusetts above Springfield. They go to Greenfield, Mass. Like 2 extra trains a day. And could we get one of those to go a little further up? And then other things about Vermont products, Vermont food on the Amtrak cars and things like that. And then appropriate money for zero fare on urban transit routes. We just had a whole presentation in our committee about a public transit study on the zero fare, and finding that there's a difference between the urban fare in Chittenden County, the urban service and the rural service, and the cost to the urban service is quite high, like $1.9 million. And what would it, and these are conversations that are going on. If we couldn't do zero fare, is there a way to give low-income people vouchers so that at least people who could pay for the bus would be paying for it, but those people would not be suffering? So these are ongoing conversations. So that's sort of the scope of the presentation.
Thank you, Representative Burke. That was a lot of detailed information quickly shared. If folks want to, maybe we'll have time for like one or two questions.
See if I can answer it.
But let's say folks have other questions afterwards. Are you open to people coming and talking to you?
Of course, or write me an email or whatever.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Representative Burke. My question is, what's the timing on moving that bill? And are you in conversation already with Senate colleagues, so you know something about the fate of this bill once it comes
Well,
over?
that's a big question. I think that at least one Senate colleague
Perchlik is back
maybe
here. If you're
knows.
and another
bill.
We have 2 Senate
Oh, we got
colleagues.
another Senate colleague
And,
in transportation.
So,
This
yes.
may be their FYI.
That's good. Thank you for the reminder to engage early, and I will do more of that. And the timing is, of course, the crossover, but the crossover deadline for transportation, which is a week later than the crossover date. So that's the timing of getting the T-bill out, whatever it includes from what's already in the administration's proposal and what's already in this proposal.
The only thing I'd say is if it's transportation's a morning committee, and if it doesn't arrive till April, and morning committees can shut down as early as the 2nd or 3rd
No, I
week of
know.
April.
Yeah. Well, we've dealt with this. I mean, this has been the usual thing. This would be passed out in March.
Great. Thank you very much. Next up, we got Jared Duvall. Oh, he brought handouts.
Thank you, Senator White. Glad to be with you, everybody. I am here today in 2 different and distinct roles, and I want to be clear about that. The first one is.
You can stand up
Okay.
and come over. Yeah.
The first role is, as Senator White said, is as Executive Director of the Energy Action Network. I know many of you are familiar with our annual progress report that we produce, each year on emissions, energy, equity, and the economy. I know many of you already have it. For those who don't, we brought extra copies. I also want to take a moment to, that is a major project pulled together by a really talented staff. And so for folks who don't know, our network manager and deputy director, Kara Robacek, is there, if you can wave your hand. And our newly hired amazing data manager, Lena Steer, is here as well. So if you have feedback on this report, putting a face to a name, this is the team along with all of our network partners and public agency partners who we work to collect data with that helps compile and produce that report. I want to be really clear. Energy Action Network, the organization and the network, we do not take positions on bills before the legislature. We do not do any lobbying. We are a just the facts, please, independent tracking and analysis organization and network. However, I am here in another role because of that work that we do on energy data tracking and analysis. What I was appointed by the Senate Committee on Committees to the Vermont Climate Council to provide expertise in energy data analysis to the council. And so in that role as a counselor, I have to speak on behalf of the recommendations in the Climate Action Plan. And as an appointed official, need to advocate for the things that we are legally bound to do and that we recommend in the Climate Action Plan. But I want to be really clear that when I am talking about a very important bill like the Affordable Heat Act, it is in my role as a member of the Vermont Climate Council, not on behalf of the organizations I also work for. So one of the things that my understanding is that I should speak in my role as a counselor now about the Affordable Heat Act briefly. Okay, so we also have the working group that has been working really closely with a lot of leaders in the legislature, especially answering questions and being a resource for the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. We have put together a 2-page overview of the Affordable Heat Act. There's also a much longer frequently asked questions document that is up on the website at eanvt.org. So I will pass these around. Maybe keep one.
And you may have seen this already. If you have not, please grab a copy. If you haven't.
I haven't, I'm gonna, well.
And in your inbox, you have a link somewhere.
So there are people who could do a much better job at giving an overview of this bill than I can, including the lead sponsor of the bill, Senator Bray, and then the co-sponsors in the Senate, of which there are many here. But I will just briefly talk about why this policy recommendation emerged from the Climate Council and why it is so important. With the passage of the Global Warming Solutions Act, Vermont's emissions reduction goals were turned into legally binding requirements. But there were other criteria that the Global Warming Solutions Act charged the Climate Council with looking at to make sure that the policy recommendations would not just reduce climate pollution, but do so equitably, help save Vermonters money by getting off of high cost and price volatile fossil fuels, and do so cost effectively and in a way that is implementable. So the council assessed many different policy options. As many of you know, pollution, climate pollution from our thermal sector, primarily how we heat our buildings and homes, as of the last greenhouse gas emissions inventory was 34% of our statewide total, only behind transportation. The preliminary data, this is not final yet, but the preliminary data that's been released by the Public Service Department previewing the next greenhouse gas inventory shows that as of 2020, the thermal sector climate pollution was now up and tied with transportation as the highest polluting sector. Now, I think part of that is likely not to continue in an effect of the changed patterns during the start of the pandemic. But either way, this is an incredibly important sector to reduce pollution and costs from. So those were the criteria. How do we meet our legal requirements and moral obligations to do our part to reduce pollution in line with the scientific consensus of what's necessary? And again, the scientific consensus of the climate science community is not act when it's comfortable and convenient. It is we have 7 years to cut our pollution in half to have a chance to preserve a habitable planet and avoid the worst consequences of a destabilized climate. Also, to do so in a way that cuts energy costs, is cost effective and equitable. So the short story here is that a clean heat standard, which is what the Affordable Heat Act would establish, is the number one pollution reduction recommendation in the Climate Action Plan. The Climate Action Plan does not add up without it. And I never like to speak in absolutes, but as somebody who is charged with doing a lot of the data analysis and tracking, I will say that I am 99.99% confident that we will not be able to meet our legal requirements without passage and implementation of Clean Heat Standard as the Affordable Heat Act would establish. The other thing that is really important is this is not just about pollution reduction. You see this graph on the front page here, which compares the different costs of heating. And the highest cost, most price volatile ways to heat homes and buildings are kerosene, fuel oil, and propane. And so this is a massive opportunity to help people get off of that roller coaster and reduce their energy bills as we use less fossil fuel through a multitude of strategies, whether that's expanded weatherization, heat pumps, advanced wood heat, biofuels replacing fossil fuels in those instances in which that's the only option, especially. And you can see on that bottom graph that the lifetime savings of taking those measures. And so there was economic analysis done for the Climate Council that showed if Vermont reduces our thermal sector pollution in line with what was laid out in the Climate Action Plan, the estimate is a net of $2 billion in savings for Vermont consumers as a result of the activity that would happen between now and 2030. Many of those savings would happen after 2030 because many of these projects reduce energy use and costs for many years. If you weatherize your home, you're getting 25 years of lower bills and lowered energy use, for instance. There are upfront costs. There are some measures that have net costs. But when you add everything together, there's a massive opportunity for lifetime savings and getting off of the fossil roller coaster, which is, I think a major win-win opportunity for cutting pollution and cutting energy costs. I will also just say one note on the policy mechanism, which is what the Affordable Heat Act would establish is a performance standard obligating importers of fossil fuels into Vermont to reduce pollution over time. And while this policy name is kind of new to Vermont, although it was discussed last year, the policy idea is very tried and true. The performance standard is the exact policy that we use in the electricity sector with the renewable energy standard. It is that Vermont has used for a very long time. And it is also a performance standard on fossil fuel importers has also been developed in and advanced over the last decade plus in California, Oregon, and Washington. So there are really good examples that we can look to about how to cost effectively, equitably, finally start requiring fossil fuel importers to reduce pollution and help Vermonters make the switch to lower cost and less polluting energy. The last thing I want to say before we go to questions, if I can say one last thing, is that you may have heard testimony from the Secretary of Natural Resources about anticipated price effects of this bill narrowly on fossil fuels. I provided testimony in response to that, which is on the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee website. The one thing I want to say here, though, is that it is so important that we look at this in a thorough, holistic, balanced way, which is that even if fossil fuel importers try to pass along their cost of compliance with this policy to their fossil fuel customers, At the same time, what we have seen from other policies in other states is that the price of the alternatives is also dropping. So if in Oregon, for instance, there was a small price increase in the cents per gallon for gasoline and diesel, but on the other side of the equation, there were massive price decreases in electricity, in biodiesel and biofuels. So the point is to help reduce people's energy costs by helping folks have pathways off of fossil fuels, not locking them into fossil fuel use.
Well said.
Those are my.
Thank you, Jared.
I think we did want you to give sort of a writ large, this overarching piece here. That being said, should we take if there are questions specific to this, because Jared has lived and breathed this as climate counsel for a long time, I think we could take 2 or 3 questions.
Go ahead, Senator Ritter.
Hi, Senator Irene Renner. Looking at the back of this 2-page handout and the third bullet down towards the bottom, it's mentioned 2025. Has that disappeared off the radar? I'm just not aware of it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the timeline that's envisioned in the Affordable Heat Act would be for it not to begin, or basically not to be fully in place until January 1st, 2026. So it would be after that first requirement. So the relevant legal requirements in the Global Warming Solutions Act, as they would apply to this policy in terms of the timeline, would just be that 2030, those 2030 and 2050 dates. But yes, the Global Warming Solutions Act still, of course, has the 2025 requirement. I will note that that is a much more, it's hard to say exactly where we are and whether we will or won't achieve it. I will say it is a much more attainable requirement or easily attainable requirement than the 2031 is, which is, significantly larger in terms of the amount of pollution reduction required.
Follow up, if I may. Do we have data maybe in that larger book that shows us on track to meet it by 2025? Do you have data?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Another question? Okay, well, Jared's pretty easy to find. If you do have questions specifically to the Affordable Heat Act, Jared, if you wanted to give sort of a high-level summary of your perspective in terms of the data analysis crunching that you do, what it means for our energy performance in the past, the policies in the past, and looking forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think just at the highest level, and I'm happy to come back and provide more if there's specific questions on this report. But overall, what we can see, I mean, Representative Stebbins just opened to this page. This is page 4 of the report. It shows our historic emissions and then what we need to do to comply with the Global Warming Solutions Act. I think it's very important to state up front that modeling that has been done by the Energy Action Network, that was done by consultants hired by the Vermont Climate Council, show that these requirements are technically achievable. We have the technology, we have the best practices that we need to be able to do that. But it's also really clear that it's not going to happen on its own. It's not going to happen on business as usual or just through kind of voluntary action or just providing some incentives here and there. The main story that the evidence from across the country and across the world shows is that if we're going to have any degree of confidence that we meet pollution reduction requirements, we need to put in place policy drivers that establish requirements and expectations and standards for how to get there. And right now, we have those policies and standards in only one of our energy sectors. That is the electricity sector. I am not going to say that those, as a counselor, those policies are perfect or can't be improved or updated. That I know will be a conversation. However, we do not have any performance standards or policy drivers or requirements on the sectors that are the elephant in the room in terms of how much energy cost and how much pollution occurs in Vermont. And those are transportation and thermal sectors. So, I think it's very clear, and I think the Climate Action Plan makes really clear that if we're going to do what we have said we are legally obligated to do, We need policies that can ensure we get there. And the number one policy recommendation to do that in the climate action plan, it was a clean heat standard. And it said, pass a clean heat standard last year and implement it in 2025. We are already a year behind. And every year that we lose, that 2030 requirement doesn't move back in time. So we have less time for compliance, which makes the task harder and potentially costlier. So the extent to which we want to make sure that this is as cost effective as possible, that means sooner action is better than continued delayed action.
Thank you, Jared. So I think we've got a couple minutes left. We're at 12:37. We want to wrap by 12:45. Any questions on what Jared just said? And then we will start popcorning. Sorry, you're so close to me. You're off the hook.
Just wanted to be respectful.
Go ahead, Robin, and then, sorry, right behind you, and then we'll go to you right after Larry.
Thank you, Jared. And I'm sorry, this is part of the graph, but something we hadn't discussed before. Agricultural emissions. Just wondering, can you, not with specific numbers, but are those driven by machinery operation, by animal flatulence, by production of fertilizers, by, what?
Yeah. Yeah, so
where's the biggest delta for change?
Yeah. So any fossil fuel use that is used in agricultural operations would be captured in one of those other sectors. Like if it's diesel used in a tractor, that's going to be captured in the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use or in the transportation sector. So the agricultural emissions don't include fossil fuel use. What it primarily is the emissions that come from methane of animals on farms, and then also and then also questions related to manure management and soil management. Those are the big ones.
Cool. Representative Sacklitz?
Yeah, you in that picture of the decreasing emissions that that you've modeled into the future. So that's all based upon existing technology. Like this is stuff that we can do now. Certainly the technology is going to change over time and we're going to see efficiencies, new technologies, other things coming online. Did the modeling process make any sort of account for the fact that we do seem to get better efficiencies over time and new technology?
It's such a good question. And you're right. It did not, I don't think, sufficiently do that. So a lot of the modeling is inherently conservative because it assumes what we have now, not necessarily what might be coming down the road. But I do think it's like technology is shifting so rapidly, and there's been so much change just within the last decade that I think it is really beneficial to pause and take a step back to say that it's really only been in the last decade that a lot of this technology that can take advantage of our electricity portfolio, which is far lower emitting than all the fossil fuels we use for transportation and heating, has become available. Electric vehicles, heat pumps, heat pump water heaters. It's a massive shift. And the benefit there is not just the ability to use lower emitting electricity versus fossil fuels. It's also that the efficiency of these technologies is so much greater, so it leads to a lot less energy use. So for instance, a heat pump to heat your home or heat your water uses energy about 3 times more efficiently than a fossil fuel boiler or furnace. And an electric vehicle, I think I would have to double check the numbers. I think it's about uses energy 5 times more efficiently than an internal combustion engine. So like when you're driving a gas car, so much of the energy you're putting into it, and therefore how much of the money is coming out of your, wallet or pocketbook is just being wasted. It's heat lost. But electric engines are far more efficient at converting energy into propulsion or heat. And so that's another win-win. It's getting onto lower emitting electricity and using energy much more efficiently. It's the combination of those things where we can reduce costs and cut pollution at the same time.
Yeah. So this sounds a lot like what we experienced with solar power, where projections were that it was going to go down in cost over time. But as we made investments into it, that we saw, we kind of got into this positive feedback loop where investments created more investments, we created better technologies, and we saw prices drop much faster than almost anybody predicted. And so what you're saying here is that when we see these really big reductions that we want to achieve, that we really shouldn't be afraid of this, that this is not just doable, but like it's really doable. We really should, if we make the proper investments now, we can see those cascading positive effects and really see big differences that we're not even accounting for yet because we're in the future and we don't have a crystal ball, but based upon other experience, seems likely.
Oh, that's exciting.
That's really well said.
Rep Sagowitz, okay, we might need you to type that up in like a larger editor, or that's pretty good. Okay, so we have 3 minutes. So,
Thank you, Jared.
thank you, Jared. I'm gonna try to do it alphabetical order, so that means David Templeman, you are our lovely ag, food, resiliency, and forestry person that we've highlighted for the Climate Solutions Caucus. Do you got a bill that we should know about?
Regarding climate change?
Yes.
Not at this time.
Great.
Well, actually, no, that's not true. I've got my reducing speed limit bill from 50 to 35 on unpaved roads. That actually is an efficiency measure. It also requires less repair of roads, which is also an impact.
You need to talk to Senator McDonald. And appropriations, Carrie Dole. Is Carrie here? No. Okay. Next up, we got Commerce and Economic Development, Jonathan Williams. Didn't see Jonathan. Then we got Corrections and Institutions, Chip Triano. Didn't see Chip. Guys, Education, Sarita. I haven't seen Sarita. Environment and Energy, Larry. Any good updates for us on bills?
So we've been started taking testimony on H126, which is the 30 by 30 bill. To come up with a plan to conserve 30% of our natural areas in a permanent way by 2030 and 50% by 2050 with what I hope are fairly obvious climate implications.
Yes. Okay. And I think that's all that we have time for, folks. So that was a great way to end. We'll get the rest of the alphabet later. One thing to note before you go is that we have a Q&A webinar tomorrow at noon that is open to the public and open to us. That's being hosted by our friends, I believe, at VNRC. Or not, is it VNRC? You're hosting it, right?
It's a joint webinar for the interested public to learn
Great.
more, hosted by several partners.
So if you have constituents who really want to talk to you about this, tell them they should also tune into the webinar. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yay, see you.